come in Saturday. Don't bother coming in Sunday.
Hey there, Joey here for School of Motion, and in this lesson we are going to create a pretty cool rig using expressions. By the end of this lesson, you'll have built your very own carousel rig that you can use over and over again in different projects, and you won't just have a cool rig, you'll also have a better understanding of how expressions work in After Effects, which is knowledge you can use to start building your own tool like this one. Don't forget to sign up for a free student account so you can grab the rig and expressions from this lesson, as well as assets from any other lesson on this site. And now, let's jump in. So this comp here is sort of the end result of our expression exercise here. And you can see I have a bunch of these freeware icons I downloaded just to sort of show you guys, how easy it is to put different images in each of the slots in this carousel. And if we look at the comp here, you can see that I have a couple of lights and a camera in there. And really those are just so we can sort of move around and see what's going on with this rig. But the meat of this is happening in this controller null right here, where we have some expression sliders and angle controls. And also these pre-comps here, these pre-comps are the actual images that are being sort of arranged in this carousel. And this controller is rigged up with a radius slider here, a rotation control, which will let us rotate the carousel. There's also X, Y, and Z offset parameters here. The reason for that is if we wanted to move the camera up top like this, we could actually rotate all of the icons. And let me zoom out here so we can see everything. So we could actually rotate this looking straight down at it if we wanted that, for example. And we could make the radius smaller. We could use the Z, and so this is really, really controllable. And then I added one more cool feature, which is this orient outward checkbox. And if you click that, you'll see that it actually orients all of the images facing outward. And then we need to adjust the offset a little bit so they're kind of facing the way we want. And then, so if you were doing kind of like a little wheel graphic where you're sort of focusing on whatever, whichever image is at the bottom of this, you could set up a pretty quick little preset where you could just kind of cycle through these things. So anyway, this is very flexible, and this is the type of thing that when I was doing this type of video a lot, I would build these things, and when I would freelance, I would bring a drive, so I had all these things with me, and that way, I kind of had my bag of tricks. And if you are, on staff somewhere, if you're freelance, this kind of stuff really, really will separate you. Every motion designer has their strengths and weaknesses, and once you kind of build up your bag of tricks, you'd be much, much more marketable. So anyway, I'm going to show you step by step how I built this, and I'm also going to try and teach you guys how I approach this, because, this was sort of complicated, but I didn't know every single step of how to build this until I built it, and I had to look online and look in the After Effects help file. So I kind of want to show you guys the process I used to build it. So what I'm going to do is I've already created a blank comp here. There's nothing in it. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new solid. So I'm going to go layer, new, solid. And I'm going to make it small, 200 by 200. I'm doing this just so that I can be very interactive while I'm doing the tutorial. You can make it whatever size you want to. All right. So we've got this this nice little solid here. So the first thing I needed to figure out was how am I going to get all of these solids to move in a circle? And there's plenty of ways to do that. But I also knew that I wanted this to be really easily customizable. And actually, let me show you guys one more feature that's built into this rig too. You can see I have 10 images here. I've built the rig so if I add more images, it actually spaces them out automatically. And if I delete images, it spaces them out automatically. So you can easily add as many or as few as you want here. And I knew that was something I was going to want to build into this rig. So to start with, I knew I wasn't going to do something like this, where I would make this a 3D layer. And let's say I just moved it 200 pixels backwards in Z. I'm going to make a new null here, make that 3D. I'm going to parent this solid to this null, and I'm just going to rotate this null on the y-axis. And you can see we're getting, a circular motion with it. The problem is, this solid is parented to this null. If I had two solids, I would have to somehow figure out how to move this solid into the right spot in relation to the null. And then I could rotate the null, and this works too. But what if I wanted these solids to always face the camera, to always face forward? Well, that would be, that would be possible with some more expressions, but it would be really difficult to figure out the math of how to, let's say I had a dozen of these layers. It'd be pretty difficult to figure out how to place them around this null. So what I thought I would try, let me just get rid of these for a second. What I thought might be a little easier to figure out is, what is the expression I can use to make a layer move in a circle? And I knew that would be possible because, I've been lurking on Creative Cow and MoGraph.net and MotionScript for years. I've just sort of checked those sites out, and I remembered seeing stuff, and I knew it was possible. And that's generally how these things start with me. I know it's possible, but I don't know how. So I went on Google, and I Googled After Effects expressions circular motion. And this was one of the results that came up. Thank you, Dan Johansson from April 12th, 2010. He typed out a couple of cool expressions here. One is to create circular motion. One is to create spiral motion. And I haven't tried that one, but that's pretty cool. So what I did was I just copied and pasted the circular motion script. All right. Now, if you haven't watched the After Effects Expressions basic video, I recommend watching that, because I'm gonna kind of buzz through how I apply these expressions and edit them and things like that. All right. So the first thing I did was apply the expression to the position keyframe of this solid. All right. So I'm just gonna paste that in. And if I scrub through this, you'll see I'm getting this moving in a perfect circle, okay? Now, let's look at this expression, because, this is pretty common to look on a website and copy and paste an expression and really not understand what it's doing. And I never like to do that, because I usually like to customize things and make them controllable. Right now, this is not very controllable. So I wanted to look at it and understand what it's doing, okay? So the first thing I see is radius equals 300. Now, if you are new to writing expressions and you have never done any sort of computer programming, this may not make sense, but if you have any experience computer programming, expressions work a lot in the same way. So what is happening here is whoever wrote this expression created a variable called radius, and you can call variables almost anything you want as long as they don't share a name with a function that you can use in After Effects. So this person is setting the radius of the circle to 300. Then for the angle, and this angle, I assume this is telling this layer which angle along the 360 degrees of the circle am I going to place this layer at? Well, the angle is set to time times 200. So what that's telling me is that every second of the After Effects comp, this layer is going to move 200 degrees around the circle. So it should take, a little over, a second and a half to do a complete rotation. And if we start at 0, then you'll see that this circle is sort of right at 3 o'clock here. And if we move forward a couple of seconds, now it's back where it started. So it's, a little over a second and a half. We're at 24 frames a second, so that's over a second and a half. So that's how this layer is moving right now. It's using the time of the comp, multiplying the second of the comp times 200 degrees, and moving that around the circle. Now, how's it actually positioning that layer around a circle? So that's what all this gibberish is, and this is some hardcore junior high geometry here. And basically what's happening is we have an x and a y variable, which are later going to be turned into the x and y value of our layer. And you can see we're using the math function, specifically the cosine, and it's doing this conversion of degrees to radians. That's a function in After Effects that converts this 200 degrees into radians. And I have to just stop and tell you that the only reason I can explain this is because I had to go back and look it up. I'm really... I'm okay at math, but I don't use cosines and sines and tangents every day. So I had to look this up, and I didn't understand this when I first looked at it, but that's okay because, as a motion designer, you shouldn't be afraid of math. You should be able to copy and paste things, but then just understand them just enough so that you can change it, to do what you want it to do. This degrees to radians function is interesting. If you remember back in geometry, whenever you're doing things with cosines and sines, you have to work with pi. And there's actually a way of expressing angles using pi. So 360 degrees of a circle, I believe, is actually 2 pi. So this basically converts the 200 degrees into a fraction of pi, and then the cosine can do its thing to it. So you don't really need to know all that. I just felt like telling you, and I'm sorry if it hurt your head at all. All right, so x is using the cosine, y is using the sine, z is 0. So since there's an x, y, and z, this tells me that this will work on a 3D layer. Now it's currently only using x and y, so it's not going to go backwards in space at all. It's just going to go up and down, but that's okay. I can modify that. All right, so then the center of the circle, and this is telling me where the center is. All right, right now the center is set to 640, 360, 0. And then this last function, add, this is basically saying take the center and whatever the result of all this geometry math here is, let's add that to the center so we can put the center wherever we want and then move this layer in a circle around it. So if I set this center to 0, 0, 0, just to show you guys what it's doing, you can see that now the center is actually up here, and so the layer is moving around, and we don't see it most of the time until it comes back into the frame. All right, and if I zoom out, you can see what it's doing. Cool. All right, so now I understood what this expression was telling me. So now I needed to figure out how I could control it. So the first thing I wanted to do, I knew I wanted this carousel to be 3D. I wanted it to work in 3D space so I could get that cool perspective shift, that looks cool and, impresses clients and all those good things. So I made this a 3D layer, and at this point, I decided, well, I'm obviously not going to just use an orange shape on this carousel. I'm going to want to be able to put whatever image I want in there. So rather than, have to swap out images into this layer, I figured I could just make this a pre-comp. So I hit Shift-Command-C, and I'm going to call this, let's just call it Image 01. And I want to leave all the attributes in my current comp because I have an expression on it. If I pick this, move all attributes into the new composition, it's going to move this expression into that new composition. And the composition is going to be the size of this one, which is 960 by 540. I actually just want this little piece to have its own comp so that at any point I could dive in, put an image in there, and then have it update. All right. So I'm gonna have this first option checked and hit OK. All right. So now the expression is still on there, but now whenever I finish my rig, I can just come in here. I could put an image in here and turn this layer off, and then when I come back into my my comp, I would be able to see the result of it. Let me close this original one here. All right, so I knew that I was going to need to first swap out this this y variable here with z, because I want this layer to move around in z space too. All right, so what I'm going to do is just delete this here. And I'm going to change this y equals to z equals. And I'm going to set y to 0. Y equals 0. And one thing that I also learned, when you write expressions that have multiple lines like this, I generally put a semicolon at the end of every line. And that is that's just kind of a programming thing. Certain programming languages require you to do that. It's like putting a period at the end of the sentence. And I was under the impression After Effects expressions needed that, but apparently they don't, because this expression worked without them. For me, because I've been doing it for so long, it looks wrong without those semicolons. So I'm going to put them in. So now they're all in there. So now I can sleep better tonight. All right. So now we have x using the cosine, y is now 0, and z is using the sine. And let me set the center to the center of my comp. So this is a 960 by 540 comp. So the center is actually going to be 480, 270. And I put that in the wrong spot. So 480, 270. All right. So now I'm just going to hit spacebar and play this. And you can see that now this thing is rotating in a perfect circle. All is good. And what's also cool about doing it this way is that this automatically orients towards us. So you don't have to do any fancy rotation or anything to keep it facing us, which you normally would have to do. It's always facing us. So the first thing to do to create a rig is to create some controls. So I could actually control the angle of this thing and create the spin at whatever speed and timing I wanted. So if you watch the previous tutorial, you'll know I'm a big fan of using a null. And I'm going to call this null control. And I use the expression controls effects to be able to control things. So what do I need to be able to control? I need to be able to control the radius of this circle, because in my head I'm picturing, okay, I've got 4 or 5 or 6 of these, and I need them spaced evenly around a circle, and I want to be able to control how big that circle is. So the other main thing is the angle. I'm going to want to be able to spin that carousel manually. So I know that this radius and this angle need to be controllable. So I'm going to grab an expression control, a slider control, and I'm going to rename that radius. All right, and then for the angle control here, angle, I'm going to grab an angle control, which you see gives me the angle dial, and I'm just going to call that carousel angle. All right, so now I'm going to click on my control layer, and I'm going to make sure, I'm going to hit E, which is going to expose all my effects, because these are effects even though they don't do anything on their own. And I'm going to open up these arrows so I can see the numbers underneath them. The reason I'm doing that is because now I'm going to come into this expression, and instead of radius equals 300, I'm going to highlight the 300 so I can replace that. And I'm going to use the expression pick whip, and I'm going to grab this slider right here, and I'm going to hit semicolon. Then I'm going to come down here where it says angle equals time times 200. I'm going to highlight time times 200, and I'm going to replace that with carousel angle. All right. So now I can manually set the radius. So let's set the radius to 100. And now this carousel angle will actually rotate that layer for me. All right, so that's great. So now we have a 1-layer carousel. And and that's a good start. But we definitely want a little bit more than that. So now I need to, I want to make sure that this carousel is totally controllable, and I could move it around if I wanted to, and I basically want to create as many controls as possible. So right here, where it says center, and it's great because it's spelled, I guess this is probably like the British spelling or something. I don't know. I don't spell it that way. But anyway, right now, this center point for this circle is being set manually with these values here. And I don't want to do that. I actually want this control null to be the center of the carousel. So if I wanted to, I could move it. Maybe I don't want to. Maybe I just want it in the center. But just in case, I'm going to make this controllable. So I want the center of the circle to be the position of this control. All right. Now, right now, this control is a 2D layer. So that's not going to work. So I need to make it 3D. And then you could do it this way. You could highlight these numbers so you can replace them. And then pick whip to the position of the control. Okay, that's one way to do it. And that will work in this case because the control is not parented to anything. You can see if I move the control around now, it will actually move that circle. So if I rotate this around and then move the control null, the actual layer and the circle, it moves with it. However, if this control was parented to something else, that wouldn't work. And just to prove it, I'll make a null, and I'm going to move that null over here, and now I'm going to parent this control to it, and you'll see our layer moved. That is because when you parent something in After Effects, and you may already know this, but when you parent something in After Effects, the position of that layer changes to become relative to its parent. So if I unparent this, see how the position just snapped back? That's because this position now, since there's no parent, is relative to the entire comp. That's its true position. But as soon as I parent it to this, it's now relative to this new null. And that's not what we want. So you can do it this way, but to be safer, we can use one more expression. So I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to replace it with, I'm going to pick whip directly to this control layer, not to the position, but actually to the layer itself. And now we're going to use an expression called toWorld. And this expression, it works, you basically select the layer that you want, and then you use the toWorld expression, and it will figure out that layer's true position regardless of what it's parented to, if it's rotated, anything like that. So the way you use an expression like this is after this comp layer control, so pointing to that layer, I'm going to hit period toWorld. And again, you could always look in here if you click this little arrow. You could look through here, and you could probably find the toWorld comp. It may not make a ton of sense, and it's better off to just learn what toWorld does and its cousin toComp. And there's going to be, again, another great tutorial about both of those. But the way toWorld works is you add toWorld parentheses, and then you have to give it a coordinate, and that coordinate is which point on this layer is going to be the center. And because we're using a null, this control layer is a null. Nulls, the anchor point of that null is at 0, 0, 0. On solids, the anchor point's usually not at 0, 0, 0. It's in the center of that layer. So this solid is 200 by 200. Its anchor point is actually 100, 100. So if we were using the toWorld expression with that, we would actually put in 100, 100, 0. But we're using a null, and null's anchor points are at 0, 0, 0. Okay? Most of the time when you use toWorld, you're going to use 0, 0, 0. But you just need to know what that number actually is referring to. So if I put 0, 0, 0 in here, close parentheses and semicolon. All right, so far, nothing has changed. This still works. However, if I parent this to this new null now, the layer doesn't move anymore. It is still tied to the control null. So this is just sort of future-proofing it. If you gave this rig to somebody to use and they parented this control null to another null so they could get some kind of funky animation out of it, it would screw everything up. So this sort of protects against that. And when you're writing expressions and making rigs, that's really important. All right, so I'm going to delete this null up here because we don't need it. All right, so now what else do we need? We are going to need a way to have more than one layer in this carousel. And so when I started building this rig, I thought it would be cool if there was a way to basically add layers to the carousel and have the carousel automatically position them in the right spot. And I knew that would be a little bit tricky, but I figured there had to be a way to do it because the expressions are so powerful. You can do almost anything you want. You just have to be kind of creative with it. So what I did was I duplicated this layer. So I have image 01, and I'm going to name this one image 02, move it underneath. And I thought to myself, what would need to change on this image 02 to put it in the right spot? I've already got, if I hit U to reveal my keyframed properties, and I look at this expression, I said, well, if there was a way I could have this layer's angle be different than image 1's angle, and specifically what I would need to do is figure out how many images there are. So let's say there was 3 images. Image 1, image 2, image 3. I would need, After Effects would somehow need to know how many images there are and then divide a circle into that many parts. So if there's 3 images, I'd have to divide that circle into 3 parts, and the first image would be at an angle, then image 2 would be 1/3 of the way around the circle at the next angle. Image 3 would be another third, and have After Effects do the math for me. So in order for that to happen, all of these layers need to know 2 things. They need to know how many images are in the carousel, and they also need to know which spot they are in the carousel. So the first part wasn't that hard. So in order to find out how many images there are, I thought, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll make a rule. All right, whoever uses this rig, this is the rule. I'm going to make a new null, and I'm just going to rename it with a bunch of dashes, and I'm going to lock it. And you could even go as far as adding a comment column to this, and I could unlock it and say nothing below this. So what my thought process was is, if I know that there's going to be a control null, everything underneath that is an image that's going to be used in the carousel. I could put things above it, but everything below it is going to be an image. Then all I need to do is find out what index in the comp this control is, and then have my layer subtract its own index, and then I'll be able to find out what spot it is in the carousel, and I could even subtract the index of the control to find out how many images there are in the carousel. As I just said that out loud, I realized that probably made no sense, but if you bear with me, I promise it will once we get going, and I'll show you guys exactly what I'm talking about. So let's go into the position keyframe for image 1. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the top of this expression, and I'm going to hit enter a few times so I can get some more space up top. So I'm gonna make 2 variables. I'm gonna make one for the number of layers in the carousel, and actually I'm gonna make a variable for the number of layers overall, and then we're gonna use that number to figure out how many layers are in the carousel. Then I'm gonna make another variable where we're gonna figure out which spot in the carousel each layer is. So I'm gonna make a variable called layer count. Okay. Layer count on its own means nothing. I have to tell After Effects what layer count means. And I had to look this up too. I didn't know this existed, but there's actually a property of compositions in After Effects called num layers. So if I type in this comp, which is this is the way that After Effects refers to the comp you are currently in, and then the property is num layers. And I should probably spell layers right, otherwise it won't work. Okay, so now my variable layer count is going to return the number of layers in the comp, which currently is 5. Okay, so keep that in mind. Then I need to know which spot in the carousel this image is. Now we know by looking at it that it's in the first spot, but After Effects doesn't know that. It's not smart enough. So what I need to do is subtract the number of layers, 5, from the index of the control null. Okay? And that will tell me the starting layer, because let's say we had a camera above this or some lights or something like that, all of these numbers would increase. So the control null is always going to be right above the first image in the carousel. So knowing that, I'm going to make a new variable, and we are going to call this object count. And this is going to tell us how many images are actually in the carousel. So object count, the number of layers in the carousel, is going to be the number of layers total in the comp minus whatever index control is at. Okay, we have 5 layers total. Control is at index 2. That means if we subtract 2 from 5, 5 minus 2 is 3. And that is how we're going to find out that we have 3 images in the carousel. All right, so it's going to be layer count minus the index of control. And the way you get the index, and when I say index, it's literally this number right next to the layer. That's the index. I'm going to pick whip the control null and put period index with a semicolon. And you're probably noticing a recurring theme here. The way expressions work in general in After Effects is you go from more general to more specific. So every time you add a period to an expression, you're getting more and more specific. So you're starting with this comp, and then there's a period. This comp layer control. So in this comp, there's a layer called control, period. We're looking at that layer's index. So general to specific. Now that we have a count of how many objects there are, now we can find out the index of this specific image in the carousel. So that would be the number of objects, 3, minus the control null's index, 2. And you'll see that works. This first image is index 3. So if I subtract 2, which is the index of the control, that gives me 1. That means this is the first image in the carousel. If we did it with image 2, which has an index of 4, if we subtract 2 from 4, that means this is the second spot in the carousel. All right, so you can see that just by doing some really simple math, we can actually figure out how many objects there are and what object index each one is in the carousel. So this object index is going to be the index of this layer, and when you are trying to find the property of the layer that you're actually typing an expression into, you don't have to type in this comp layer. If you don't type that in, it assumes you are referring to the current layer you're working on. So if I type in index, it's going to give me the index for this layer, which is 3. And we need to subtract the index of control. So I pick whipped control. I'm going to put period index. Okay. All right, so now we have the information we need to figure out how to divide that circle up and place all of these layers into the right spots. All right. So what I need to do is figure out how to divide a circle, which is 360 degrees, into a few different pieces and place things in the right spot. All right, so the property that we're going to be changing here is angle. And so the first thing I want to do is I need to separate out the angle from the controller with the actual angle that this is going to be placed at. Because if we're if our control is set to 180 degrees, meaning I've spun the entire carousel 180 degrees, image 3 is not going to be at 180 degrees. It might be at, it might be at 270 degrees. It's going to be somewhere else. So I want to separate those variables out. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to stretch this out so I can see a little better. So this variable here, angle, I'm going to rename that control. Because this is the angle coming right out of the control. This is the raw angle, but this is not actually the angle that I want to use. All right? So let's think about this for a second. You have 360 degrees in a circle. So if we have three images here. So if the control is set to 0, then this first image can be at 0. But the second image needs to be 1/3 of the way around the circle. So if I do a little math, 360 divided by 3 is 120. So the second image would be at 120. The third image would be at 240. So basically all we need to do is divide 360 by the number of layers in this carousel, and then we just need to multiply that number, whatever the distance is between layers. We just need to multiply that times the place in the carousel that each layer holds. So let me type that in and see if that makes any more sense than what I just said. So what we need to calculate is an offset. What is the offset? Basically the spacing between layers. All right, so I'm going to make a new variable called offset, and this is going to be 360 degrees divided by the object count. So we have 3 objects, so the offset so far is 360 degrees divided by 3, 120. However, this is the first image, this is the second image, they're all going to have different offsets. The first image is going to have an offset of 120, but then the next image has to be 240. So what we need to do is take that offset, we need to multiply it by the object index. What is the spot this layer occupies in the carousel? Okay. Cool. So if you think about what this is going to do, the first layer is going to be 360 divided by 3 times 1. It's going to be 120. If this same expression is on the next one, that will be at 240, not 120. So by doing this, we're letting After Effects do all the math for us, and if I create more layers in theory, it should space them out evenly for us no matter how many we have. All right, so the last step is to actually calculate the real angle. All right, so in order to do that, I need to create a new angle variable. So the actual final angle of these layers needs to be whatever this offset is now, plus whatever the control angle is set to. So that way we can still animate it. So if the control was set to 0, then After Effects would spread all of these layers around, and then as we animate it up to 180, it's going to add 180 to every offset of every layer, and it's going to move them all in a circle together in sync. So this angle needs to be control angle plus offset. Okay. Now, if I've done this right, this should work. So I'm going to hit Control Enter. Sorry, I'm going to hit Enter. And you'll see that something, I basically only have that expression on this layer right now. So I'm going to hit U, click position, and if you go up to edit, you can copy expression only. In this case, you could also copy, because copy expression only is useful because if you had keyframes on position and the expressions were actually referencing the keyframes you had on there, you could copy the expression without copying the keyframes, and that can be pretty useful sometimes. So I copy that expression and I'm just going to paste it onto image 2 and image 3. And let's see if this works now. All right. So we have 3 layers, and they all seem to be spread out evenly. Now to check that, I'm going to add a camera. Let's just do a 35mm camera. And I'm going to grab my camera, rotate tool, and just kind of pan up here so we can see it. All right. So I hope that all made sense. This slider here is feeding the control angle variable in all of these. So right now the control angle is -55. Then we've calculated the offset. How far apart do each of these layers need to be? There's 3 layers, so they each need to be 120 degrees apart. So the actual angle is going to be -55 plus 120, and we're going to take that 120 and multiply it times 1 on this layer, 2 on this layer, and 3 on this layer. And that's how we're getting this even distribution. And what's great about this is because if we duplicate these layers, you can see that it doesn't matter how many layers we add. After Effects is always going to spread these out evenly for us now. All right, so we've got the beginnings of a pretty cool rig here that will be very helpful. So now we have all these layers. I'm going to increase the radius, and you see we've got all this control. I can move the control null around. I can slide this. Now I knew early on that once I built this, I sort of moved the camera around. I said, well, this is pretty great right here. However, what if we have a camera that's moving around, or what if we want to use the carousel from the top down like this? I want to be able to control where these layers are facing, so that we can sort of manually tweak that to get the look we want and get the angle we want. So what I did was I started with one of these layers, image 1, and I opened up the rotation tab, and I just I suspected this would be pretty simple, but I wanted to see how these things would react, because we have a pretty complicated expression on the position property. But even with all of that going on, you can still just grab the X, Y, and Z rotation. All right. So in order to have that fine tuning control, really all we need to do is create a control for X, Y, and Z rotation, and have all of these images reference that same control. So in my control null, I'm going to make a new angle control, and we're going to call this X offset, Y offset, and Z offset. And I'm just going to I'm going to hold Option and click on X rotation, and you can see I need to make sure that I have my effects opened up on this control null. Otherwise, as soon as I hit add an expression, I didn't have anywhere to pick whip it to. So I'm going to open all these up. All right, so X rotation is going to be tied to this X offset. Y rotation is going to be tied to the Y offset. Z rotation will be tied to the Z offset. And then I'm going to copy the expressions from image 1 that I just created, and I'm going to paste them onto all of these images. And then now these controls should work. So the X offset rotates on the X axis, Y is on the Y, Z is on the Z. That's great. So now if I take this camera and move overhead and zoom out a little bit, I can rotate these on the X to face me. and then rotate the carousel, and they'll move in a circle, but they'll all face me. So far, we pretty good shape here. So the last thing that I wanted to add to this rig, which I thought would be really cool, is an option to have these layers face outward. So face sort of in a tangent to the circle instead of always facing the camera. Using the carousel like this is pretty common. And so this is probably most of the time how you'd want to use it. But you never know. And I mean, you could also use a setup like this to do some really cool motion graphics things that, without using icons or logos or whatever you'd normally use this for, you could create cool shapes and wheels and things like that. So I wanted that option, and I want it to be really simple to set up. So what I figured was I need to be able to rotate these, basically control the Y rotation of all of them. Because the Y-axis runs up and down, and that's where you'd rotate to turn those layers to face them outward. So if I look at image 1, I hit R, I realize that I still have my orientation property that has no keyframe on it. So rather than try and do some funky math with the Y rotation that's being driven by this control, where I'd have to kind of figure out how do I adjust this but still have them face outward? It would be kind of tricky. I can use this orientation property, and you'll see if I adjust the Y orientation, I can rotate this to face outward. So that's what I needed to do. So right now my control angle is set to 0, and I wanted to figure out what number of degrees do I need to turn these images to face outward instead of right at us. And I'm going to be turning them on the Y-axis because you can see here's the Y-axis. And if you turn it on that, you can make them face outward, right? Just like that. So I wanted to figure out what's the number of degrees I need to turn this for it to face the correct direction. And with the control angle set to 0, it turned out that this needs to be about 270. And that gave me a hint of how I was going to set this up, because if you split a circle into 90-degree sections, you'll get 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and then 270 degrees. So I said, oh, that's interesting. This solid over here appears to be facing straight out to the right, and it happens to be 270 degrees is the right angle for it to face outward instead of directly at me when my control angle is set to 0. So it's a difference of 90 degrees. So I thought maybe all I need to do is subtract 90 degrees from my control angle. So that's what I tried. I put an expression on orientation, and I said Y equals, because I'm going to be messing with the Y rotation, I pointed it to the control angle minus 90, and then that little error message just came up. That's telling me that this property, orientation, it's looking for 3 values, X, Y, and Z. So you actually need to give it 3 values, even if you're only changing one of them. The way you do that in After Effects is you open some brackets, and then we're going to start with the X value, which is always going to be 0. The Y value is going to be this Y variable we just calculated up here, and then another comma and a 0 for the Z property. Close the bracket, semicolon, and there we go. So now this is facing the right way, but when I turned the carousel, you see that it's spinning around kind of opposite of the way it needs to go. However, it is consistent, so I thought, well, maybe then all I need to do is subtract this control angle times -1, and maybe that'll fix it. So I just put a negative sign at the beginning of this expression here, and that fixed it. So now you can see that one layer that has the expression is facing outward. Okay. Now I wanted to have an easy way of turning that on and off, and After Effects has this really cool expression control. So I'm going to go to my control null and I'm going to add a checkbox control, which is basically just an on and off switch. And I'm going to call this face outward. By default, it's off. And in order to make this work, I'm going to have to give it an if-then statement. All right. So the way you do this with a checkbox control. So I'm going to add a few more lines here. So to do an if-then statement in After Effects, this works like almost any other programming language out there. And I'm just going to briefly go over it. All you need to know is the syntax of making it work. And then on your own, you should definitely play around with it because you can get really crazy with controls and creating a lot of automated things with if-then statements. So the way it works is you type in if, in parentheses, you type in the thing you're testing, all right? And what we're testing is this checkbox on or off? So I'm going to pick whip directly to that checkbox. And actually, that's all you need to do. Technically, a checkbox, it either equals 0 when it's off or 1 when it's on. That's how they return values. But if you don't type, you don't have to type in equals 1. If you do an if-then statement and the only possible options are 0 or 1, then if you just leave this, if you just close the parentheses here and leave this in there, then this will return a 1 if this is on and a 0 if it's off. So you don't even need to do any more than that. If you wanted to, you could come in here and type in equals 1. If this checkbox equals 1. And when you're testing things with if-then statements, you have to do double equal signs. You can't do a 1 equal sign. That won't work. All right. So we're testing. Does this equal 1? Is it checked? So then we're gonna do these curly brackets. So we're gonna open curly brackets, and this is how you tell After Effects, I'm about to give you a series of things that you only do if this is true. Okay. And you can actually go on to the next line to start that. So if this is true, let me open this up a little more so we can see it better. All right, so if this is true, this is what I want to do. All right. If it's checked, this is how I want you to calculate the angle. All right. So all you need to do is leave that as is. Then underneath this, you have to close the curly brackets. Okay. Now what happens if it's not checked? Well, if it's not checked, you want to do something else. So ironically, that's what you're going to type in. You're going to type in else. All right. So if this happens, do this. Else, otherwise, you're going to open another set of little curly brackets. Go to another line. If this is not checked, I want these to all be 0. So I'm just going to do a bracket 0, 0, 0, close bracket, semicolon, and then close the curly Q. So you have 2 sets of instructions inside of little curly Qs. One set gets executed if that's checked. The other one gets executed if it's not checked. And there you go. So now if I check this, you'll see that turns that behavior on and off. And so now I'm going to copy that expression for orientation onto all of these. Okay. And let's see if that worked. So if we turn this on, aha, you'll see it didn't work. That is because, once again, we are going to need After Effects to adjust that angle based on the position in the circle. So once again, we're going to have to multiply that 90-degree offset by the position in the circle. So what we're going to need to do is, so let's just pick one of these images here. So I'm going to hit U so I can see all of our expressions we have. So the position expression has all of this stuff up here that already sort of does the work for us of figuring out, which like how many layers there are, and then which sequence in the circle the layer exists in. So I'm going to copy all of this stuff, basically everything from the layer count down to the angle. We don't need to have all of this math stuff down here because all we're going to be doing is rotating this. We're not going to be moving it. All right, so I'm going to just copy all of this, and then I'm going to put it at the top of this orientation expression here. I'm going to paste it in. So now this orientation expression is getting pretty long. Kind of scary looking. So then what we need to do is basically figure out, what's the property that needs to change to make all these face outwards. We already know that for one of these layers, all we had to do was subtract 90 from the inverse of whatever the control angle was. So what that means is that if this one needs to be 90 to face the right way, what does this one need to be? Well, it would need to be 90 plus whatever the offset angle is, because we've already calculated, we've already split this circle up into 7 parts because there's 7 layers here. And so we know that if one solid is facing the right way at 90 degrees, then the next one's going to be 90 degrees plus 360 divided by 7. So we've already got this, we've got the angle of that layer already calculated right here. And it's based on all of this work we did up here. So what we need to do is instead of using the control angle, which is what this is, we actually want to use the offset. Or sorry, not the offset, the angle. All right? And I know this might be a little confusing. Remember that we set up 2 variables, the control angle, which is what the control null is set to, but then the actual angle, which takes into account the position of each layer. That's the angle that we want to multiply times -1, then subtract 90 from. Okay, and you can see already that we were working on image 1, which is this, and now it is facing outward. So now I think this expression is correct. So I'm going to copy that expression. I'm going to paste it on all these one more time, and now they all face outward. So if we rotate this using the control null, they all face outward, and then if I turn this off, they all face forward. And there you go. There's your rig. Just a last few minute housekeeping things that I did. Right now, all of these are the same pre-comp. Even though we've named the layers different things, you'll see if we click layer name to show the source name, instead, they're all image 1. So if I go in here and I grab one of these icons, like this little clock, stick that in there. Turn off the orange solid. You'll see that they're all the same. And that's obviously not what we want. So what I did was I made a bunch of pre-comps, image 1 through 10, and I just went through one by one and replaced just like this. I just replaced all the layers with their own pre-comp. So now you could actually go in and swap out any of these layers with any image you want. Currently, these are set to 200 by 200 pixels, which is pretty small. It's really only useful if you're just doing little icons. But you could definitely scale these up. It's not going to affect anything. This expression will work regardless of how big these layers are. You may have to increase the radius if you need to, and that's about it. So I am going to post this rig up for you guys, and I'll clean it up a little bit before I do that. I'm also going to post all of these icons for you zipped up. So if you want, you can try to, you can mess around with it, and all of these properties are keyframeable. In the little demo I did at the beginning of this video, I had to keyframe some of those things because the camera was moving around. One last thing I want to show you guys, which I actually did to make this even simpler to use. is I created a remote control for this rig, and I'll show you why that's cool. So if we have this this comp here, which is called Carousel Toot, and we bring it into a new comp, all right. So as it is, this is just a static layer, right? If I add a camera to the scene and I move it around, you'll see nothing happens. But if I hit this sunburst looking button here, which is the collapse transformations button, this is now back to a true 3D layer. However, it's all contained in this one pre-comp. And the reason that is useful is because now you can apply effects to this whole setup in one go. So if you wanted to tint this, and give it like a purple tint or something, you could do that to this pre-comp and then still move a camera around, and have this 3D comp. And then what I did in the demo, which is just a cheap trick that I'm ashamed of, you can duplicate this comp. Take one of them, name it Reflection. Scale it -100 on the y-axis, and then move it down a little bit so it's underneath. And then just turn the transparency way down. And now you have the poor man's reflection, reflective floor. And Apple did this a decade ago and ruined it for everybody. But you could even blur this a little bit if you want to get really fancy, right? So now the problem is that even though this is cool, you would have to go into this pre-comp to control the actual rotation and all that stuff. And that's gonna be really annoying. So here's what I did. I'm going to copy this control null, and I'm going to bring it into this pre-comp and paste it, and I'm going to rename it Remote. Now, wouldn't it be great if these sliders could actually control the sliders inside of this pre-comp? Well, actually, you can do that. And here's how you do that. So you need to have both comps open, which we do. We have Carousel Toot 2, which I'm going to rename Master. It's clearer. So we have Master, and then we have our Carousel pre-comp here, okay? And what you can do is click. You need to have them both visible and open at the same time. So if you click these little dots on the edge of the tab, click and drag, you can drag this composition window down and put it underneath the pre-comp composition. Now you have two comp windows open at the same time. And I'm going to stretch this out so we can get a little screen real estate here. All right, so here's the actual controls. So if I hit E, and I can open all of these up so we can see all of the sliders. And now here's our remote, and I'm going to hit E. So I basically want all of these values to be driven by these values. And it's really as easy as just option clicking and pick whipping. One by one, just like that. And by the way, you can do this technique with any property in After Effects. And this is also pretty useful if you have a camera in this comp and also a camera in this comp and you want them to be in sync with each other. You can do this with the position rotation of the cameras too. So anyway, so let me close this now. And let's bring this back down. So now, this remote control null will actually control these layers which are inside of a pre-comp. And so now this is really comically simple to animate. And all of these things work, even the face outward checkbox works. So you're all set. Now you can do whatever you want with this. And let's say all of a sudden you need to add one more icon. All you got to do is come in here and just add one more. And it will automatically update and space out and work perfectly. Thank you guys so much, and look forward to next time.
Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a ton about expressions and how to use them to build a really useful and reusable rig like this carousel. If you have any questions or thoughts, let us know, and we'd love to hear from you if you use this on a project. So give us a shout on Twitter @SchoolofMotion and show us what you've done. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.